And share screen. Okay, that's it. Larissa, are you there? Larissa, if you can hear me, can you mute your microphone? I'm having trouble with it. So.
I was trying to mute her, but it won't let me.
It won't let me either. That's kind of strange. It should mute everybody automatically when they come in. So I don't know. Maybe she heard us. Okay, just to review from last week, we looked at Micah 2-7 as content related to the footsteps of Messiah. And we went through and just kind of made some bullet points as to how these prophecies of Micah concerning the footsteps, how they would look in a modern day. And as it turned out, once we kind of, put it in bullet points, it sounded so much like modern headlines. And so would this have been in every generation's headlines? I don't really know. Possibly some of it, much of it, all of it really does seem to fit our generation. But what I want to point out before we skip into lesson 75, I think it's 75, in spite of all the terrible things that are listed in this prophecy, the betrayal, the bloodshed, the bribery, in the name of donations and so forth, the strange juxtaposition of posting the watchman, but simultaneously the punishment will come when the watchmen finally realize who they are, what they need to do. This is the time to expect the confusion and the punishment. But I want to point out the last 3 lines here on the slide before I slide down to where I want to start tonight and go full screen with it. It says, but as for me, in spite of all these things we're reading about the footsteps of Messiah and the tribulation of it, it says, but as for me, I will watch expectantly for the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. And that's important. God will hear me. That's in this week's lessons, the reciprocity of the relationship. Adonai asks us to hear him. He asks us to listen to him. Well, the verse that we're working with, of course, is I am my beloved's and he is mine. And so therefore, in this reciprocity, if we hear him, if we listen to him, then the implication is that he will reciprocate and he will hear us and he will listen to us. So at a time of mankind's darkest hour, such as Micah's describing here, the encouragement that we receive is that if we will open our ears, if we will become those watchmen, if we will watch expectantly for the Lord, if we will see tribulation, not in despair and confusion like the rest of the world, if we will say, oh, I hear footsteps, if we will watch expectantly for him and start to assume our roles, if we will wait, it says, for the God of my salvation, then he will hear us. And that's the good news. That's kind of what I wanted to repeat before we get into lesson 75. Okay. So reciprocity, it's the relationship of the beloved to his people and his people to their beloved. Again, it's a reciprocal agreement, not based on any sort of parity. It's not based on any sort of equality in the arrangement. It's not. He is the creator. We are the created. Ted, but last week we tried to find some examples of how the Father doesn't need our help, but we need to help. We need to learn how to help. And so just like, a father teaching his son how to drywall, the father doesn't need the son's help to patch the drywall. The son is the one who needs to help to patch the drywall. And so this kind of describes the relationship of reciprocity, not that he needs our help or can't function without our help. He can, and he's going to show us how he can function without our help, but he still wants us to help. So this prophecy in the Song of Songs, I am my beloved's and he is mine, it will be fulfilled when we call upon him. Kind of going back to last week's text in Micah, nevertheless, I am going to wait expectantly. I am going to watch expectantly for the El of my salvation. If we're looking and watching, then he will appear. And so when we call upon him, then he can in turn call upon us. Again, not because he has no other option, but because we need to help. We need to assume the role that we were created to function in. So even though he's going to look around and he's going to say, wait a minute, there's nobody here who can help. There's nobody here who is willing, who's qualified, who can function as a prophet like Moses. There's no one on earth who can help me. And so therefore his arm, Yeshua, he will use his own arm. He will help himself through Yeshua. And so then we see the footsteps of Messiah that appear on the mountains. He's calling us from the mountains with the good news of the feasts and the Sabbaths. How can we know that that outstretched arm of Yeshua is on the mountains? Well, I think one characteristic of this time is that there's going to be good news that's proclaimed. And it's not just good news of salvation, it's paired with the good news of the feasts. And of course, the feasts are based on the Sabbaths. The weekly Sabbath is a feast, plus you have the 7 feasts of Israel. And so he's calling us with his own arm, kind of with his own feet, if we think of the footsteps of Yeshua. He's telling us to return, to repair if we have failed to maintain the walls, if we have allowed the walls to break down, if there have been breaches in the wall, he says, come back. And when, by virtue of coming back, you will begin to repair and you will begin to build. Because these are what those stones are made of. This is what we're returning to. So we return, we repair, we start building. And then we have to guard those places. If we start building up a wall in scripture, remember, they had a sword in one hand and a hammer in the other when they came to rebuild the walls. They had some people who watched, they had one who would watch, and they had one who would work. And this is the attitude that we're going to have. It's teamwork. At the same time you're building and repairing, you're also guarding against the enemy. This is how we can help. This is how we can restore those breaches, those places in the wall that have been broken down. And if we think of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and those stones that have been torn down, then the restoration of those stones indicates a return to the feast, because Jerusalem was the focal point of the feast, especially, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the 3 pilgrimage feasts. Why do the walls need to be repaired? They need to be repaired in order to be prepared for the return of Israel. And that's where we can step in if we are awaiting eagerly, if we are watching eagerly for our salvation to return with his good news, especially of the feasts and the Sabbaths, then we are part of that restoration. So let's look at a couple of verses here. They're not that far apart from one another in Isaiah. We want to look first at Isaiah 59:16. And then Isaiah 63:5. And again, the theme here is, how do we help him? We know that he is our helper. There's no doubt about that. But how do we help him? And what is lacking when he's asking for help? What is lacking? And so he says in Isaiah 59:16, he says, and he saw that there was no one, and was amazed that there was not one to intercede. Then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. So there's a sense of amazement here that out of all the people in the world, there is not one who is able to intercede. And of course, Moses is the measuring stick. In terms of Messiah, Moses would still be the measuring stick, because the prophet that would come would be like Moses. He would have characteristics of Moses. That's how the people would be able to identify him. Moses is the measuring line. And he's saying, I'm looking around, and he doesn't define, I don't think, a generation, probably many generations. And he's amazed that in those generations, there is not one on the spiritual level of Moses who is able to intercede. And if we look at Abraham, there is a model of intercession. He interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses, up the level where Abraham intercedes and bargains down to 10 righteous people, Moses bargains and says, if you're going to wipe them out, wipe me out. That is the self-sacrifice of Moses. And so somebody willing to give his life for the sake of the sheep, even though they don't deserve it. Just like Sodom and Gomorrah, they didn't deserve mercy. Abraham interceded for mercy. The Israelites didn't deserve mercy after the golden calf, but Moses intercedes for mercy. And this is the heart that the helper has to have. If one is going to be called upon be called by the Holy One to help him, the quality we're looking for is intercession at the stake of one's own life. And of course, Yeshua fits this bill 100%. He is the prophet like Moses. He was a master intercessor. He died for a world knowing that it would be probably a small percentage of that world that would ever turn to him for salvation and be grateful for that rescue of their lives. That even as he's being nailed to the cross, Yeshua says, forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing. He's interceding while he's dying. This is the type of person that can help Adonai, one who is willing to intercede for those who don't deserve it. And so it puts a lot of our petty little arguments in perspective when we look at this and we realize it's pathetic that there was no one who could fit this job description. And then as we slide down into Isaiah 63:5, it's very similar. He says, I looked, but there was no one to help. And I was astonished, and there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought salvation to me, and my wrath upheld me. Think of the implication of that statement. Adonai wanted salvation. But remember, it goes back to, does he need anything? No, he's the creator. But are there those among his creation who need to help him for their own sake? Yes. Like the father-son. We're going to talk about the father-son relationship, the shepherd flock. relationship. In this case, he's saying, you know what? Out of all my creation, there's nothing out there that can uphold me. There's nothing out there that can bring salvation to me. And therefore, he says, I will save myself. That's how strong he is. He can save himself, but he still wants us to help. And as we progress through this lesson this week, we'll see how we became his helpers in this process. But the difference between the two verses, if you'll compare them, of course, there's intercession, and then there's uphold. But when you look at what upheld him in the first passage, it's his righteousness, his own arm. Yeshua was his righteousness. In Yeshua, we see the righteousness of Elohim. That is what upheld him, his own righteousness. But in the second passage, it says, my wrath upheld me. That's a little scary. It sounds pretty good to say his own righteousness upheld him. We can see the righteousness of Yeshua, but it's hard to see Yeshua as the wrath of the Lamb. And this is what is going to uphold. And I would suggest that we don't understand exactly what kind of salvation he is seeking, what kind of help, what kind of upholding. We can only see it through human eyes. The mystery in these verses is, how does that look from his perspective? But I did want to point out the difference in the two ways that he's upheld. He's upheld through his own righteousness, and then ultimately his wrath is going to uphold him. So we have the opportunity to get on the wagon here with Yeshua's righteousness. We can be part of this plan that is bringing salvation. As we acknowledge Yeshua as our salvation, and we acknowledge him as our righteousness, then what we're saying is the righteousness that's in Yeshua is the righteousness of the Father himself. What we don't want is to suffer what he's saying here. My own arm brought salvation, and this time the salvation is coming through wrath. And of course, we've talked about this before, but just to review, remember, Yeshua is the arm. He's the long-term prophetic fulfillment. And so it's going to be his righteousness that is fulfilled in us. Only when we acquire his righteousness are we going to be able to respond when we are invited to help the Holy One. How can we help the Holy One? Well, through his own righteousness. That's why Paul just hammered all the time this message of grace that got twisted so badly. And, being made righteous through works of the law, it got completely twisted out of context, because any commandment you keep is his own righteousness. It didn't originate in you. He allowed you to walk in that righteousness. He gave that righteousness to you, but you were not the creator of that righteousness. You were the doer of that righteousness. And so you allow that righteousness to be fulfilled in you. And this is part, apparently, according to Isaiah, of the process of Yeshua bringing salvation. And apparently it's also going to be part of the wrath of the Lamb. We must maintain his righteousness. That's how we're going to be able to help the Father repair the walls. We have to mature. We have to grow in maturity. We have to be able to respond when he calls. If we are clueless as to his righteousness, then how will you help him? How will you understand when he calls what he's calling for? If he's calling, if we hear the footsteps of Messiah on the mountains calling with the good news and restoring the feast to the world, if we're still in a state of immaturity and we remain in that state of immaturity, then we're really not helping. but he is willing to help us learn how to repair the ancient walls. There comes a time where he's saying you need to be mature. It goes back to the fig tree and the vineyard. At some point, you need to mature. You can't remain a nursing child. How can you help the Holy One in this plan if you're a total dependent at all times? If you have never learned to walk in his righteousness with any degree of skill, you're not much of a helper. You might be saved, but you're not much of a helper. You're not going to be much use when it's time to start repairing the walls. And so this is how we want to move our friends who don't yet understand the feast. Maybe they've not heard about the feast and so forth. We want to be able to proclaim that and speak that into their lives, because that is the righteousness of Yeshua. And as they begin to take hold of that, however quickly or long it might take, what they are doing is being equipped to also begin to repair the ancient walls. And we want to teach them how to do that before the wrath upholds him. So let's look at a larger chunk of this section of Isaiah. Let's go to Isaiah 58:8, because we want to get a better context. Sometimes you can read things out of context and they make perfect sense, but a lot of times the full context will add a bigger picture and help us understand how we fit in that bigger picture. So if he is reestablishing his helpers, if the beloved is calling to his helpers from the mountains, if he's calling to them through the footsteps of Messiah to come repair the walls, then these are the words. Remember, he's looking around for someone to help. There's no one to help. Apparently, generations are passing. There's no one to help. So from the time that the righteousness of Yeshua goes forth, and of course, he's crucified, he's resurrected, he's taken back to heaven. And then the next appearance is apparently the wrath. When Yeshua appears again, it's not just his righteousness that we notice, it's going to be his wrath that characterizes him. Because remember, there was nobody who could intercede and stand in the gap. There was no one qualified. And as much as we would like to think we are not. We're still in a kind of a chaotic stage, but I see what Isaiah 58:8 is saying. He says, then your light will break out like the dawn, and your recovery will spring up quickly. See, at the point where we start listening, really listening to him, and he's proclaiming the good news. And so now our ears are tuned to a different channel. It's not tuned to world news. Instead, it's tuned to the good news on the mountain. And remember, he's proclaiming the feasts. He's proclaiming the righteousness of Yeshua, which is the righteousness of the word. As we hear the righteousness of the word, then there is a restoration and a reparation on the wall. Because remember, the Torah is a light and the commandment is a lamp. If we are going to help Adonai, then we have to walk in the light of the Torah and in the lamp of the commandments. This is how we help him. And this is how we escape the wrath. And this is why we're told several times in the letters of the apostles, we are not appointed to wrath. Now, I don't think they were directing those words to people who might have, made a verbal commitment to Yeshua and then went on living like the devil. I think he's directing this people who are walking the best way they know how in the righteousness of Yeshua. They were as faithful as they know how to be. Yes, we're falling short, but they're as faithful as they know how to be. He's calling to this generation again. He's calling out. He's teaching his Sabbaths. He's teaching his feasts. He's teaching the righteousness, the full righteousness of Yeshua. not just the righteousness that starts in Matthew 1:1. And when we do this, he is calling forth his helpers to repair his walls. Because apparently there's no human being since Moses, other than Yeshua, who's able to do this. But he says, you heed the call here. He says, then your light will break out like the dawn and your recovery will spring up quickly. This is what we want to do, recover. This is what I believe this generation is doing. We are recovering the light of the Torah. He says, and your righteousness will go before you. Whose righteousness? Ours? Well, yeah, but it wasn't originally ours. Originally, it was Yeshua's righteousness that we put on. And where did Yeshua's righteousness come from? It came from the Father. We have put on the Father's righteousness, and it will go before you. The glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. Okay, here's the call for help. This is a helping question. We call for help, and he helps. But what happens when he calls upon us for help? He says, you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. Remember, this is a phrase that pops up in scripture where, Adonai calls somebody like Samuel or Abraham, and they say, here I am. Well, how are you available? It's when you're willing to walk with his righteousness going before you. So you cry for help, and he will say, here I am. But here's what has to happen. If there was no intercessor like Moses, there was a particular quality of Moses that was missing, and he told us exactly what it was. It was intercession. There was no one to intercede. No one to intercede for a people who did not deserve mercy. So he says, I still want that. I'm still looking. I want you to help me. You cried to him for help, and he said, here I am. And now he says, here's how you help me. I want you to be like Moses. He says, if you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness. You see how important that is? The pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness. And it doesn't just mean people outside the faith. I think it especially means people of like kind and like mind. The adversary doesn't have to work too hard if we're just pointing the fingers at each other and speaking wickedness of one another. He says, if you offer yourself to the hungry and satisfy the need of the afflicted, then your light will rise in the darkness and your gloom will become like midday. And the Lord will continually guide you and satisfy your desire in scorched places and give strength to your bones. And you will be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail, which is absolutely wonderful considering if this is the footsteps of Messiah upon us, we're about to face drought and famine. He says he's going to satisfy your desire in scorched places. He's the one who's going to give strength to your bones. He says, those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. Now, some people are rising up who can help. They've not achieved the level of Yeshua, but they are beginning to rise up and to be equipped to help. When that strong arm starts going forth, he says, those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the age-old foundations, and you will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets in which to dwell. That's us, guys. If we're walking in the righteousness of Yeshua, if we are heeding the good news on the mountain as the footsteps come, if we're turning back to his Sabbaths and turning back to his feasts, he says, now you're answering my call for help. You've been calling upon me for help. Now I'm calling you. I want you to rebuild the ancient ruins of my city. I want you to raise up the age-old foundations of my temple. I want you to fill in the holes in the wall where people just don't understand things anymore. You're going to have to explain the light of the Torah to them because they lost it. Somewhere between Matthew and Revelation, they lost it. So you're going to repair that breach in their understanding. You're going to restore the streets in which to dwell. And here's how you do it. You say, how can I help him? Right here, he tells you exactly. You don't have to wonder how you can help Adonai. If you want to be a helper, and I do. I want to help him. He's helped me in so many ways. He has sustained me in so many ways. He has said, here I am to me in so many ways. How do I say, here I am to him? He says, it's simple. If because of the Sabbath, you restrain your foot from doing as you wish on my holy day and call the Sabbath a pleasure and the holy day of the Lord honorable and honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. This is awesome, guys. I know you guys know this passage, but did you ever think it was the answer to what you could do for him? You called on him, he answered. And now he says, I'm calling you. I want you to rebuild the ancient ruins, raise up the old foundations, repair the breach, restore the streets, make the streets safe to dwell. How do I do it? He says, keep my Shabbat. You keep my Shabbat. And you keep from speaking your own word. You speak his word. You speak his righteousness. And it's going to become a delight. You are going to become that helper. Ezekiel 22:30 says, there was no one to build a fence and stand in the breach before me for the sake of the land so that it might not be destroyed, but I did not find anyone. He says it's for the sake of the land. It's for the sake of the land of Israel, because the physical land of Israel represents to us the Garden of Eden and the resurrection of the dead. Who can intercede for that? Who can build a fence around the vineyard and stand in the breach? If there's a hole in the breach around the wall around the vineyard, who's going to stand in there? Well, apparently many generations pass by when you could not find a person who could build the fence around the vineyard or stand in the breach for the sake of the land, because you had one set of covenant people who didn't recognize the righteousness of Yeshua in the person of Yeshua. And then you have another set of covenant people who do not recognize the righteousness of Yeshua, the light of the Torah. You need these things to be able to build the fence and to stand in the breach before him. It's a unique person for many, many, many generations that it went on and on and on, who could profoundly understand the salvation and the light of Yeshua enough to build the fence and stand in the breach like Moses and to intercede for people who did not deserve it. And he says there wasn't anyone. There have been some great men. We've had Noah, we've had Elijah, we've had Queen Esther, but for all their righteousness, even in those generations, there was never another one except Yeshua who stood like Moses, interceding for a nation And so this arm of the Holy One is Yeshua. He is that prophet like unto Moses. He is the only capable helper who can save and restore the vineyard. In fact, he can do one better than Moses. He can open the gate to the garden. Remember the three keys? He's got the keys of famine, he's got the keys of childbirth, and the keys of resurrection. And see, those all three keys, they're not meant to go into the hands of a human being. But Yeshua will hold them all in Revelation. Remember the woman in travail? He's got the keys of childbirth. The famine, he has that key. The resurrection, he has that key. And so I think in Revelation, what we're seeing is the birth pangs of Messiah are opening the gates to the repairers of the breach. He's letting those in who will build a fence, who will stand in the breach with him because they have taken on his righteousness and allowed it to go ahead of them. And therefore, the helpers begin to rally around Yeshua. They begin to rally around the Messiah in order to proclaim the light. Because, the prophets say as it gets darker, that those who walk in righteousness will shine brighter and brighter. The darker the days become, the more we shine. But he's looking for those who are willing to stand in the breach, who are willing to intercede. It's the Shabbat. That's how we help. Being sacrificial believers like Yeshua, that's how we help. And sometimes, keeping the Sabbath, it's not going to be popular with your friends and families and coworkers. But are you willing to stand in the breach? That's the question. It's if you take the easy way out, then you didn't stand in the breach. They need to see you standing there to encourage them, because not everybody gets it in a day or a week or a year. You keep standing in that breach. You keep building, and you'll be surprised at who joins you and who starts helping you build up those holes in the wall. So it does kind of make sense that in a time like the footsteps of Messiah, where righteousness is scarce, that's the exact time it's going to be restored. These repairers of the walls of Jerusalem, the repairers of the walls of the vineyard, around the vineyard, surrounding it to protect it. This is going to begin with the greatest and the first commandment, to have no other gods. He is one. And that first commandment, again, it's implied through the seventh day. When Elohim rested, it says, he finished his work and he rests. So what does he create on the seventh day? He creates the first Sabbath. He creates rest. And so that great commandment to have no other gods, when we keep the Shabbat, it's just one more approach into having no other gods before him. When you rest on his Shabbat like he did, again, he says you're standing in the breach when you do that. You're helping me. You're saying, here I am, when you rest on Shabbat. And because you're proclaiming to the nations, no matter what gods of commerce, of doctrine or theology or anything else that people invent, there is still only one, and that is the one who rested on the first Shabbat. And so, again, we've been divided, just like the Tower of Babel. Believers have been divided, they've been scattered, but it's time. He's calling them back. He's calling from the mountains. He's saying, return, and I want you to proclaim that I am one. Tell the world that I am one. Tell them that I am the King of creation. And the way that you're going to do this is you're going to start guarding my Shabbat. This is how you guard the walls of Jerusalem. This is how you begin to repair the breaches in the wall around the vineyard. So here, let me go forward one so you can see it in English. Wow, that was strange. Okay. This is a prayer that is done on the Sabbath in the synagogue. If you attend a Messianic Jewish synagogue, you'll probably do this prayer. It's called the Veshamru. And you can hear Shomer in the title, because it has to do with keeping, observing, being a watchman, being vigilant. It says, and the children of Israel shall keep the Shabbat, observing it throughout their generations as an everlasting covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. All right, it's a very simple prayer, but it's profound because it's a rationale for why the children of Israel shall keep the Shabbat. And keep that term children and filed away in your mind until tomorrow's lesson, because we're going to look again at the father-child relationship, not just shepherd flock, but father and child. Because each of these they're as you assemble them together, we're getting a wonderful picture of the uniqueness of the relationship. It's the children of Israel who keep the Shabbat. That is unique to them. Even though there are people who are keeping Shabbat who maybe don't keep the whole covenant, they figured this much out. They heard part of the call here. It's telling them that you have an identity. Respond to that identity, because it's throughout generations as an everlasting covenant. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. And what is happening here? It's an affirmation, again, of Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. He is one. There is only one creator. Only one. Has only ever been one. So if he is the only one, and he rested and was refreshed on the seventh day, then by virtue of keeping the Shabbat as this sign that you belong to the beloved and he belongs to you, you are proclaiming his oneness. You are proclaiming that he is the King of the universe. It's really a vital piece of liturgy for the Shabbat, because it reminds you why you're keeping the Shabbat and the job that you're doing. You're guarding it. You are a watchman on the wall when you keep Shabbat. You are standing in a hole in the wall to keep the little foxes out and the big foxes and all manner of predators. You're keeping them out of the vineyard when you keep Shabbat. If you were not present at Shabbat, then you have left that particular hole that was appointed to you wide open for every predator to run into the vineyard. So let me back up here. And this is a transliteration. If you do have a Shabbat Siddur, then you will have this particular prayer in Hebrew. But if you can't read the Hebrew, then probably you would already have maybe an interlinear, a transliteration. This does have a little tune that goes with it. And like I say, I'm not real proud of my singing ability. But if you would like to sing this, if you do not have a fellowship or a congregation, if right now you're kind of alone in your home as a congregation of one until he joins you and links you with somebody next door on the wall, I'll try to sing this for you. And that way you'll have the recording. And if you just keep running the recording back, then you can teach it to yourself. Or, and of course, you can always click on Jeremiah Greenberg's Messianic Shabbat Siddur on my homepage at www.thecreationgospel.com. Don't email me and ask me where to find it. I've told you too many times. But go to the homepage and it should be right there, easy to see. You just click on that. And unless something's happened in the last few weeks, that click should take you straight to a Shabbat Siddur. And then you can also, if you want, purchase the accompanying CD where he'll sing the tune for you, way better than I'm about to. But this prayer is so important because it's explaining this unique relationship that you have with the Father. When someone asks you why you're keeping Shabbat, why won't you go to the annual sale? Why won't you go to the amusement park, with the kids booster club or whatever? Why are you putting your foot down on Shabbat? This is why, because you don't want to leave your post. This prayer teaches you that Shabbat is your post. If you're walking in the righteousness of Yeshua, Yeshua never left his post. Yeshua went into the synagogue every Shabbat. He worshiped at the temple. That was his custom. And so if this was his custom, then this should be our custom. We should walk in that righteousness too. We should never leave our post of Shabbat. No matter where you are, doesn't matter physically where you are, you know what Shabbat is. And so once you know what it is, you have to guard that. You don't let the little foxes or the big foxes or anything else come and spoil Shabbat. It's how you're helping Adonai. Do you want to tell him you're not available today? You have something else you need to do that's more pressing than helping him when he's merely allowing you. He doesn't have to let you keep the Shabbat. But you call on him all the time and he says, here I am. But every Shabbat he calls on you, and do we say, here I am? Or do we sigh? Or do we wish it were shorter? Or do we wish that, we had everything that so-and-so has, to enjoy Shabbat? Do we complain about it? Or we just say it's a delight? If I've got nothing more than 4 ounces of grape juice and a loaf of bread and a prayer book and the Torah, what else do I need? But you can pray that he will add all these things that make it even more of a delight, that he will add your fellowship, that he will add your family, that he will add your friends. But he called you first. And you have to say, here I am. Or there's an empty spot where there should be a guard. And we know what happens when the guards leave their posts. The vineyard gets raided. So anyway, Veshamru. Veshamru v'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם כי 6 ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ וביום השביעי שבת It's a beautiful tune, but the relationship that you feel in your spirit when you sing that tune, you're special when you sing it. He has said to you, here I am. And now is my opportunity to say to him, here I am, by saying the Veshamru, that I'm going to keep the Sabbath, because my beloved is mine and I am his. And that's what the Shabbat is. It's to shomer. You hear that in Veshamru. You hear the sheresh of it. Keeping the Shabbat is to shomer, to guard and watch over it. And it's service, it's work. What is the work of Shabbat? The work of Shabbat, or avodah, is the service of it. You have to zealously protect it from anything that breaks down its walls and would spoil the young blossoms. We tend to think of Shabbat as maybe making challah, pouring grape juice, having a nice meal, meeting with like-minded believers, reading the Torah portions. But there's a sense of, if I just guard it, if I don't let the world in here, if I don't let the commercial world in here on Shabbat, it's not that I'm so much doing anything. In other words, I can't point to the loaf of bread, that's guarding it, but there's a doing nothing that's doing everything. And that doing nothing that's doing everything is guarding your boundaries. What will you let inside Shabbat? And what will you push outside Shabbat? You have to go back to Nehemiah and look at the struggle he had in Jerusalem with keeping the merchants out of Jerusalem on Shabbat. It was so bad because the people would keep buying that stuff. And so finally, they had to start locking the gates of Jerusalem and putting the Levites on the gates to literally guard it. Don't think your Shabbat will be any easier to guard than Nehemiah's. In fact, Nehemiah was written to you to warn you how difficult it was going to be to guard your Shabbat and to proclaim the oneness of the Creator. To tell the world that my beloved is mine and I am his, that's not going to be an easy thing most weeks, because you will have to consciously decide, not just on Shabbat, but the 6 days preceding it as you prepare. If you don't prepare on the 6 days before, you're going to have lots of visitors on Shabbat that you really don't want. So Shabbat is the culmination of what you have prepared the 6 days before. So when you return to the Sabbath, it's restoring that first and greatest commandment. You are acknowledging Elohim as creator and the only creator. So on Shabbat, typically, what do? You typically have bread and wine, or the fruit of the vine. You don't want wine. If you want grape juice, that's just fine. But you want to have the fruit of the vine on Shabbat, and it's called kiddush. You make a blessing over the cup of wine. And of course, kiddush is holiness or sanctification. It's, again, you're guarding Shabbat. And by making the blessing over the fruit of the vine, drinking the fruit of the vine, drinking that cup of sanctification, you're doing your part to say, here I am. Think of that, this Erev Shabbat coming up. If you can file that away and then pull it out at the proper time, as you're saying the blessing over the fruit of the vine on Erev Shabbat, and as you drink, as you sip that, as you taste that sweet wine or that sweet grape juice, as you drink the Kiddush cup, understand, even though it seems like it's not that magnificent a thing, with the drinking of that cup, you are guarding. You were standing in that breach in the wall. You were building the walls of Jerusalem with that cup. You were saying, here I am with that cup. So when we drink that cup, it's reminding us we have a watchman over the vineyard who cared enough to retrieve us and stick us back on the wall. And so if he sticks us back on the wall, then we are called to watch over it and to protect it. Keeping Shabbat, it's our way of saying, here I am, I can help. I know he doesn't need my help, but he's letting me help. And if we can convey this to kids, I think it's for them something very tangible, because, the younger they are, the more they want to help and the less capable they are of helping. In fact, their help usually ends up being more work. And sometimes maybe that's the case with us as his children. We think we're helping him on Shabbat, but we don't quite know everything we're supposed to know on Shabbat. So we end up being more work for the Holy One than helping him. But I think, like any good father, he enjoys that process because he can see we are trying. We might be fumbling and bumbling around and breaking stuff and messing stuff up and having to do over. That's okay. He wants that effort because he knows we are growing into being the guardians of the vineyard. He knows we are growing into being the builders who can walk with Yeshua, that our ears are tuned to his frequency. And so instead of wasting our time railing against tribulation, instead, we are ha'azinu, we are giving ear to the proclamation of his footsteps. And we're holding fast to Shabbat. We're holding fast to the feasts. We're interceding for people who don't deserve it. And that's the sort of relationship that every Shabbat reminds us of. Not that it's not special every other day, but especially on Shabbat, because you drink the cup. It reminds you that you're part of the vineyard. The grape juice or the wine, as you drink it, you say, oh yeah, I'm part of the vineyard, Israel. And if I'm part of the vineyard, then I need to hold my spot. I need to guard this vineyard so that if there are tender blossoms within it, that the little foxes can't get in there and destroy them before they ever turn into clusters and then mature into ripe clusters. So based on your level of maturity, do the best you can. We just read in Isaiah, none of us are good enough. None of us are strong enough. None of us are willing enough yet. But if we keep listening for the footsteps of Yeshua, then he promised us that he is going to raise us up. And what did he call us back here? You will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets in which to dwell. And you will raise up the old foundations and rebuild the ancient ruins. If you will call his Sabbath a delight, that's our inheritance. This is what the Father calls us to do. And it's exciting. It's extremely exciting. You just stand in there, right? It's okay if you don't do it perfectly. It's okay if you didn't do the right blessing or you didn't pronounce the Hebrew right in the blessing. It's okay. We're little kids anyway, right? You just hang in there. You just keep standing in that hole. You might not be the most intimidating Levite on that wall or at that gate, but you just remember whose righteousness and whose power you're walking in, and know Yeshua standing right behind you. So the enemy may not be scared of you, but I guarantee you he's scared of the one standing behind you, because what does it say? His righteousness will go before you. You've got a shield in front of you that is going to uphold you. So, guys, I hate to stop here tonight. I'm thinking I can get a little bit more time tomorrow. I just don't want to inconvenience anybody by keeping them out too late to come lock up. But I appreciate you hanging in there with me. But I hope this gives you huge encouragement going into Shabbat. that you understand who you are. And that you hold your place no matter what. You don't have to run laps. You don't have to run laps on the wall. You just have to stand in your spot, which is a good thing because I can't run laps. I'm good. I'll just stand right here. If you need a chair, sit down. They let Moses sit down, right? You get you a rock and you sit down, but don't you leave your post. Shabbat is your post. And you hang in there. So hate to do this. I'm gonna have to end the session, but I'll see some of you tomorrow. And I want you to have a wonderful week. I'm going to be praying for you. I'll still do prayer for you. And just start thinking of ways you can beautify the commandment of Shabbat going into this next Shabbat. But you're already beautiful. Just the look on you guys are shining right now. I wish you could see your faces. It's like the light of Shabbat's all over you. I don't know what's going on. But don't lose it. It's just like I see prophecy coming to pass. You are going to shine like the light, and you're doing it right now, even on this Zoom video. I don't know how it's happening, but you keep shining. And I'll see some of you tomorrow, okay? Love you.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Toda.